The Locked On Podcast Network presents the NFL Big 3 in 30. The three biggest stories in the NFL from our local experts at the Locked On Podcast Network. We bring you the real story, why it matters, what's next, who wins the big game, and more, all in 30 minutes. The NFL Big 3 in 30 starts now with the biggest story in the NFL.
So much about this hiring feels different than the past Chicago Bears coaching failures.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast.
And I think we're all looking around today, pinching ourselves a little bit, and maybe in a little bit of disbelief that the Bears actually got their guy, got the top guy in the coaching search, because that's the first thing that feels distinctly different here than previous Bears head coaching searches. Ben Johnson is the candidate that seemingly every other team wanted, or at least most other teams wanted. The Las Vegas Raiders and Tom Brady were hot on Ben Johnson and trying to do everything in their power to bring him into the Sin City. The Jacksonville Jaguars were going hard after Ben Johnson and really wanted to pair him with Trevor Lawrence. I think some of the other teams in the head coaching search got the impression that they weren't as high on Ben Johnson's list, so maybe they kind of backed out a little bit, but you ask around the NFL and around fan bases, this was the consensus top guy. Most fans of most teams who have a head coaching opening wanted their team to hire Ben Johnson. And the Bears don't usually land that guy. When you think back to previous Bears head coaching searches, you can even just look right at Matt Eberflus or even, Mark Trestman and stuff before that. Like, the Bears hire a coach, usually it's a guy that, okay, he was a pretty good assistant coach or something, and there's a few things to like, and maybe he'll be a good coach. But, he's not like some out-of-this-world candidate. It's kind of a second or third choice type of vibe is usually what the Bears get. Not with Ben Johnson. They pulled him away from the Raiders. They pulled him away from the Jaguars. They got the coach that everybody else wanted. And I know some people will point to, when the Bears hired Matt Nagy, he was a pretty hot coaching candidate, having worked with Patrick Mahomes and under Andy Reid. But even Matt Nagy came with a lot of question marks about his offense too, having not been the play caller in Kansas City. That was part of the, I guess, the downside or the risk with the hiring of Matt Nagy at the time that gave some people pause. Not that Ben Johnson doesn't have any questions or downside or risk or whatever, but I think there's a lot fewer question marks about what Ben Johnson does on offense than what Matt Nagy does on offense. Both coaches carry some questions about how good of a head coach will there be. We've seen Ben Johnson be a great offensive coordinator. We've never seen Ben Johnson be a head coach. So that doesn't mean, just because he was a great offensive coordinator, doesn't mean he'll be a great head coach. But we didn't know how great of an offensive coordinator Matt Nagy was. We just knew he was underneath Andy Reid. And so I think while Ben Johnson's green flags can give you a lot of confidence and faith in him as a head coaching hire, it does not guarantee he's going to be a great head coaching hire. But I do think it protects us in a way where Bears fans are never going to be able to look back some years in the future and say, oh man, the Bears really should have hired this other candidate, that we should have known at the time that the Bears got the wrong guy. Maybe sometimes with previous Bears head coaching hires, they hire somebody and like, ooh, that wasn't really who I wanted or who you thought they should want, and there was this other candidate that would have been so much better. That doesn't exist right now. Ben Johnson is it. You won't look back and have the Mark Trestman, Bruce Arians debate about, if only they had hired that other guy. A lot of people wanted them to hire that other guy, but they didn't hire the guy everybody wanted. This time, they hired the guy that everybody wanted, and we just haven't seen that happen much at all in recent Chicago Bears history. That gives me so much more confidence in saying, I don't know if it's going to work, but this is their best shot toward being able to make it work. There's something to be said about the wisdom of the crowd here and being the team that everyone else wanted to be in this coaching cycle. The other green flag that jumps out at me outside of Chicago here is if you look at the reaction of especially Green Bay Packers fans, but also Minnesota Vikings fans and Detroit Lions fans. This is the coach Packers fans did not want the Chicago Bears to hire. This is the coach Minnesota Vikings fans did not want the Chicago Bears to hire. And certainly the Detroit Lions didn't want Ben Johnson staying within the division. Usually when your enemies, quote unquote, aren't a fan of a move that you make, it's usually a good sign that you probably made a good move, or at least made a smart process decision, right? Again, doesn't guarantee results, but it's the decision that everyone was afraid that you would do because they don't want you to do good things. The people who don't want you to do good things think you did something good here, right? They're not gaslighting you. It's not a biasy thing. It's like they're worried. They're upset. They wanted Ben Johnson out of the division. The Bears kept him in the division and are also making some moves with and around Ben Johnson that's attracting the ire of other NFC North fans around this. And when it comes to the coaching staff that Ben Johnson is putting together, I want to talk about that in a little bit here, and some of the other things in this process that strike me as why this feels different. Not just about Ben Johnson as the candidate, but also how the Bears have gone about hiring Ben Johnson as their head coach. Ben Johnson is going into his first ever head coaching job very intentionally. He has been someone who's bided his time, waited for the right opportunities, but has been working towards this for a little while yet. He's done interviews for a couple of years, but kind of been sitting and waiting for the right opportunity to strike. And having all that time to prepare, I think, is helping Ben Johnson come to Chicago with a great plan on the front end. And I think it's going to be a really important part of this process, how he surrounds himself with coaches. Yes, he's going to be the offensive play caller. Yes, he's got to be in charge of setting the culture and being a leader and communicating and being the guy that everyone looks to in all the big moments. But he can't do everything himself. And he's going to need, especially on the defensive side of the ball, someone else to really pay some extra attention to manage that and sort of be, if he's sort of the offensive coordinator as head coach, he might need a defensive coordinator as head coach, a head coach of the defense to be in charge of that side of the ball with maybe a little less input from Ben Johnson comparatively to other coaches that might be more hands-on with both sides of the ball. He may need to be more hands-on on offense and more hands-off on defense. And so we get reporting not long after the Bears make the hire that the leading candidate to be the Chicago Bears defensive coordinator is none other than former New Orleans Saints head coach Dennis Allen. And at the same time, the Bears are also heavily pursuing former Saints interim head coach Darren Rizzi as their special teams coach. Now, the Bears have to, I think there's rules actually, that they have to conduct interviews for those positions. So it's not like Ben Johnson can just show up on Tuesday and say, these guys are hired, hand them contracts. Like, I think there's a formal process they have to go through that at this point is kind of more of a wink and a nod and an elbow and a nudge. But still, like, there's a reason why I think the language Adam Schefter uses there is that, Dennis Allen is expected to be the top candidate Bears are pursuing. That's their way of saying they can't officially say Dennis Allen will be the defensive coordinator. They can't officially say Darren Rizzi will be the special teams coordinator, but he's saying they're going to be once they actually go through this process. And okay, like right away you could say, well, Dennis Allen sucked as a head coach for the Saints, and Dennis Allen sucked as a head coach for the Las Vegas Raiders. Why should we be so excited about him being the Bears' new defensive coordinator? And it's worth noting, like, when he was before he became the Saints head coach, he was the Saints defensive coordinator. And they had 4 years in a row ranking as a top 10 defense in New Orleans and never ranked lower than 19th with him as their defensive coordinator. They were always consistently good defenses. He's someone, and we're going to go more in depth on Dennis Allen and Darren Rizzi in the coming weeks, or the coming days here on the podcast. We're going to talk to Ross Jackson from Locked On Saints about Dennis Allen and Darren Rizzi. But just as an overview right now, coached good defenses, creative in mixing up his fronts to generate a pass rush. Like, he's not like the world's most aggressive, like blitzer, for example. Like, yeah, they blitz sometimes, but this is not, Brian Flores and the Minnesota Vikings. Like, if you look at the Saints' blitz rates, they tend to kind of hover down around where the Bears' blitz rates have been, where, not the very bottom of the NFL, but they tend to be a little bit more of a four-man rush type of team. But it always kind of fluctuates a little bit year to year and can depend on, how much pass rush talent they have versus how much they think they need to send extra pass rushers. But they like to stunt and twist and show different looks at the line of scrimmage. And he likes to disguise coverages on the back end. They definitely will play a lot more man coverage under Dennis Allen than what we've seen under Matt Eberflus, but it's not like it's going to be all man coverage, and they're able to mix some things up on the back end there as well. And then Darren Rizzi has been an interim head coach now for the Saints and is a well-respected special teams coordinator who's now has some of that head coach experience under his belt, coached special teams in New Orleans and Miami before that, where he worked with Ben Johnson. There's a lot of familiarity with him and this coaching staff. And that's one of the big green flags here. Because do you remember when Matt Eberflus was hired by the Chicago Bears? Yeah, he brought in a bunch of his Colts defensive coaches. But when Matt Eberflus was putting together his offense, he hired Lou Getsy, who he had never worked before, his quarterbacks coach Andrew Janocko, he had never worked with before, his offensive line coach Chris Morgan, he had never worked with before, his running backs coach something Walker was the guy they fired for HR violations. He brought in a bunch of offensive coaches that he had never actually worked with before, and it felt like it was too many cooks in the kitchen with a lot of different ideas from a lot of different backgrounds that couldn't all align in one offensive identity. Ben Johnson is bringing in guys he knows with experience.
From the first whistle to the final drive, FanDuel makes the NFL playoffs even more exciting. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win your first bet. That's $300 to keep the action going. The FanDuel app is easy to navigate, and the variety of bets keeps every game exciting. Plus, when you win, you get paid instantly. No waiting around for your winnings. Whether you're betting on your favorite team or just looking to add some extra excitement for the playoffs, FanDuel has you covered. The NFC Championship, Patrick Mahomes versus Josh Allen. Allen got the best of this matchup during the regular season, but FanDuel has opened the line in favor of Mahomes. What else is new? The Chiefs, 1.5 point edge over the Bills right now, which means our friends at FanDuel see this one as essentially a coin flip with the Chiefs getting home field advantage. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today and get started with $300 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com. Make this playoff season unforgettable with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL.
The Indianapolis Colts have their new defensive coordinator in Lou Anarumo.
You are Locked On Colts, your daily Indianapolis Colts podcast.
Lou Anarumo, the Colts' new defensive coordinator. He was with the Cincinnati Bengals from 2019 to 2024. Overall, and Jake, we'll get into this in a second. Overall, not a super successful stint with the Bengals. Like, there were some growing pains early on, and there were some rough patches in the later parts, which is why he's kind of available right now. But if we want to really push optimism on this signing, or on this hiring, for a better term there, 2021 Bengals and 2022 Bengals were the peak of his powers, I guess. The mad scientist, Lou Anarumo, that's where he was called the mad scientist, for what he was able to do in those two seasons with the Bengals. He was the architect behind that Bengals defense that essentially dragged, again, it feels weird to say this, but a bad Bengals offense in that postseason to the Super Bowl and nearly got them a Super Bowl championship. And then the next season in 2022, they had a very strong defense and went all the way to the AFC Championship game the next season as well. Lou Anarumo, again, for the imperfectness that started his tenure with the Bengals and for the end of his tenure, during that 2-season stretch, the Bengals are one of the best defenses in football.
Yeah, they really were. They had a complete unit that was clicking on all cylinders. And this is when I think of defenses who kind of had quick turnarounds, this is when I think of one that has used free agency really, really well to make modest signings come together to make a really cohesive full defense. And I know there's going to be parts of the Colts fan base where this isn't a very popular pick. When we've talked about Anarumo over the last couple of weeks, people have been like, yeah, but he cost the Bengals a playoff spot, this season and everything. There's layers to this basically. Now schematically and ability to adapt and move guys around and do creative things, Anarumo is beyond what Gus Bradley was doing, but it comes down to personnel. I mean, the Bengals lost several really important starting defenders over the last couple years. They lost Jesse Bates, one of the top free safeties in the NFL, Chidobe Awuzie, DJ Reader, Eli Apple, Von Bell left and came back. So a lot of this guy's most important pieces, communicators, leaders on that defense, they were shown the door. I mean, the offense had a ton of money funneled into it, but there is gray area as to why statistically it didn't always look pretty, but this is a guy who holds guys accountable, which is one of the biggest things you want to see here. He's a leader. Again, you said the mad scientist moniker, that's from his players. That's the players always felt like this guy had an effective creative game plan for them going into each week. He had guys really bought into what his plans were. And you think of a lot of big games, like the Kansas City Chiefs. There's been games against, the Ravens and some AFC powerhouses. Not always against the Ravens, but
sometimes it's hard. Lamar Jackson's tough.
When you face each other twice a year, there's a lot that can happen. But yeah. I see Anarumo as a guy who is able to kind of get some misfits together and perform really well. And also his teams rose to the challenge in big moments a lot, I felt. So this is maybe not a hire where it's going to look pretty 24/7. But I think overall this is going to be a really good move in the right direction for this defense. And you're going to see some guys maybe maximize their potential. Even, free agents, you don't have to get a bunch of high price guys, but the more modest signings, I think that might come in a little more, and they're going to get the most out of those guys, hopefully.
Yeah. And let me contextualize his tenure with the Cincinnati Bengals. I'm going to do so in a way that I think would make Bengals and Colts fans pretty happy with. I'm going to be fair to both sides here. So Lou Anarumo comes in 2019 with Zach Taylor, and the Bengals on defense were an older unit that just wasn't very good yet. They had to refresh a lot of the group on that side of the ball in terms of free agent signings, in terms of draft picks. They hit on several draft picks, linebacker Logan Wilson, Jermaine Pratt, Jesse Bates, Cam Taylor, Britt. Like, those were guys they drafted who came in and did some good things. And they also had some good signings that were productive for them. Eli Apple, DJ Reader was a huge one. Chidobe Awuzie was a signing as well that came in. I think he came from the Cowboys. Yep. So when they had all of those things come together with the draft hits, along with big time signings in 2021, in 2022, it was a very good unit. They really started to figure out in the second half of 2021 how good of a unit they could be. And then you look at that playoff run to the Super Bowl. I think they had like 7 turnovers forced in the 3 games leading up to the Super Bowl. There was a game against the Tennessee Titans, who were, I think, were the 1 seed that year, where the Bengals had like 6 sacks in that game too. It was a really, really strong playoff run. Carried over to 2022, did some really good things. And then you started seeing the talent depart from the defense. Now, as a defensive coordinator, you need to adjust to that. There needs to be adjustment. And they did bring in younger players for him to supplant those veterans with. Dax Hill, they just didn't really figure out a way to utilize him until the second half of this past season. So, Lou Anarumo certainly deserves some fault for what happened with the Bengals this season. It's not only because talent departed, but I will say when he did start to stubbornly move off of some of the veterans that he had in place early this season, because again, your choice was a lot of these veteran players that have been productive for him, or younger players who may not have been ready. It took some time to move to those younger players. And we did see in the second half of this season, the Bengals defense did start to creep back up towards the middle of the road in EPA per play with a lot of younger players. And again, without that top talent like the DJ Reader, Chidobe Awuzie, and the Jesse Bates of the world. So I think overall it was a pretty successful tenure with the Bengals. It certainly made sense why they wanted to move on, because most of this year was not great. But he was able to right the ship a little bit towards the end of the season when the Bengals were making their playoff stretch or their playoff push late in the year. So, again, there was the peaks and valleys of his tenure with the Bengals. I wouldn't say it was like some superstar home run tenure, but it had some really, really great moments. And I think even when, the struggles did start to happen late in 2023 and for the first half of 2024, he did find a way to right the ship. Now, it was a little too late, obviously, this season, but they did find a way to find some success late this season when the Bengals were pushing for the playoffs. So Lou Anarumo, in my opinion, and we're going to get into more of the film stuff here in a second, like the schematic stuff in segment 2, but in my opinion, a very good defensive coach. I wouldn't say he's like a top tier, like number 1 defensive coordinator in football, but like you said, Jake, he gets his units ready to play for big matchups. He does performed pretty well in the playoffs. And when he's had the personnel in the past, he's been able to put out some really strong defenses for the Bengals. So I think this is a really good hire. I feel much better about this hire than I did about the Gus Bradley hire a couple years ago. And honestly, Lou Anarumo, for my money, aside from Dennis Allen, was the best defensive coordinator on the market. I very, very much like this hire, and I think it's going to be very good for the Colts. I think this was a Shane Steichen-led hire. I think this is who Shane Steichen wanted. And you guys are going to get a more aggressive defensive coach who is more willing to adapt on defense. So everything the Colts fans have kind of wanted, aside from like a Wink Martindale, like 70% blitz rate, like they're not going to get that, but you're going to get a more adaptable defensive coach, which I think is much better than what we've had here with the static defenses of Gus Bradley and even Matt Eberflus before that.
Yeah, all I know is I got to see this defense up close and personal back in August when the Colts were in Cincinnati for the joint practice in the preseason. And the Bengals defense had the Colts offense's number. Let's just say that. There was a very viral moment of a lot of smack talk coming from the Bengals defense.
I love going to live events, whether it's sports, music, theater, or comedy. One of the most fun evenings this year was me and my wife getting a chance to go out. The excitement, the energy, it's unforgettable. It's unmistakable. Gametime has a new feature called Gametime Picks that makes getting tickets for your favorite live events even easier. Gametime Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. Curation makes it easier to save more on sports, concerts, comedy, theater, and more near you. You can take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDON for $20 off your purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDON for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Gametime.
The Commanders and Eagles are going to face off in the NFC Championship game.
You are Locked On Commanders, your daily podcast on the Washington Commanders. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
The tale of the tape and key matchups between the Eagles and the Commanders for this weekend's NFC Championship game. And of course, we're starting it all off with the biggest one, Saquon Barkley, Philadelphia Eagles running back, against the Washington Commanders defense. And we're going to do that thanks to our friends at Prize Picks. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL. Use the code, all lowercase, LockedOnNFL to win $50 instantly when you play your first $5. The Commanders and Eagles are facing off in the NFC Championship game. It'll be the third time they play each other. The rubber match, each of them has a win. And of course, the Washington Commanders' best chances are going to rest with how they can handle Saquon Barkley and this Philadelphia Eagles rushing attack. The NFC Championship game, tale of the tape. We've got two teams, Philadelphia Eagles, Washington Commanders. In the regular season, Washington Commanders went 12-5, Philadelphia Eagles 14-3. The Philadelphia Eagles winning the NFC East Division title for, I think it's like the fourth time in the last 7 years or something crazy like that. Eagles have been one of the top teams in the NFC East, certainly for quite some time now. Point differentials this season, Washington outscored their opponents in total this year by 94 points, while the Philadelphia Eagles held an advantage in that category, outscoring their opponents this season by 160. Of course, head-to-head, they are 1-1 against each other this season. Philadelphia got the 26-18 win over the Washington Commanders in Week 11 on Thursday Night Football in Philadelphia. The Eagles in that game had 434 total yards of offense, 228 of those yards coming on the ground. Washington lost the turnover battle -1. Philadelphia won the time of possession 33 minutes and 4 seconds to 26 minutes and 56 seconds. But Washington held a 10-6 lead entering the fourth quarter of that game. But Philadelphia outscored the Washington Commanders 20-8, leading ultimately, or 20-8 in the fourth quarter, ultimately leading to the victory. And that 20 points that the Eagles scored in that fourth quarter, the second most points allowed in a fourth quarter this season. The team that scored the most points against the Commanders in the fourth quarter, the Dallas Cowboys, the very next week. Obviously, this Eagles game, Cowboys game, part of that 3-game slide that the Washington Commanders had there in the front half of the back half of the season. Washington won the second matchup between these two teams 36-33 in Week 16 in Northwest Stadium in Landover, Maryland. Of course, that was a game-winning touchdown pass and catch. Jaden Daniels finding Jamison Crowder in the end zone to win that game. Washington had 368 yards of total offense in that game to lead the way, but Philly still was able to amass 211 yards rushing in the game. Of course, Washington lost the turnover differential -3 in the turnover differential. And you might remember first team to ever turn the ball over 5 times, give up 30 points, and still win the game. Philadelphia won the time of possession, 36 minutes, 18 seconds to 23 minutes, 42 seconds. And then Washington entered the fourth quarter of that game trailing by 13, outscored Philly 22-6 in the fourth quarter. It's the only 20-plus fourth quarter given up this season by the Eagles. In fact, the only quarter where the Eagles defense gave up 20 or more points at all in the entirety of the season, including the postseason. So certainly some anomalies in this season matchup this year between these two teams. But the bottom line is both teams have a win, and both teams won after trailing in the fourth quarter. So I'm not going to tell you that you should hope your team is trailing in the fourth quarter of any game. But in this series this year, which has been really weird and kind of topsy-turvy, the Washington Commanders, Philadelphia Eagles have each won the game that they ended up trailing in when we entered the fourth quarter. Washington is -4 against the Philadelphia Eagles in turnover differential all season. So obviously they're going to want to undo a little bit of that. The last time these teams met in the playoffs was the only time they met in the playoffs, 1990 NFL playoffs. Washington won that game 20-6 in the wild card round of that year's playoffs. The Commanders would then go on, Washington would then go on to lose to the San Francisco 49ers in the divisional round. As far as history is concerned, with number 6 seeds making it to the Super Bowl, the Pittsburgh Steelers were the first to ever do it in Super Bowl 40. The Green Bay Packers did it most recently. They beat the Pittsburgh Steelers in that Super Bowl 45, 5 years later, after the Pittsburgh Steelers were able to do it. The good news is, as far as I can tell, those are the only 2 6 seeds that I can track down that made it to the Super Bowl. They also both won their respective Super Bowls. So I'm not telling you that if the Commanders make it, you're guaranteed they're going to win, but history certainly is sitting on their side. So we get to these key matchups here, right? And I asked insiders for their key matchup. I also wanted to open up the mailbag and see if we can find a question or two to hit here. Really, we're going to talk about the matchups, but we are going to hit one mailbag question because it also goes with the most popular key matchup coming into this game. The mailbag question said, Barkley killed us both games in the regular season. What do you think our approach will or should be to mitigate damage from him specifically? And is he the biggest concern on the Eagles offense? And then listen, I think Saquon Barkley absolutely is the biggest concern on the offense, but it's not because of what he simply does on the field. It's because of what he can do early on the field and the pressure that can put on your opposing offense. So obviously the Philadelphia Eagles defense is very good. They got a little bit banged up in the divisional round matchup against the Los Angeles Rams. We'll have to see as we get through the week of practice and practice reports how that really impacts them, but especially the loss of Quinyon Mitchell potentially in that game and potentially in this upcoming game could loom very, very large if he's not able to go with what I believe is a shoulder injury. Again, we'll track that more as we get into the rest of the week. But the impact of Saquon Barkley, if you want to look at it on a surface level, the Eagles have only lost one game when Saquon had over 100 yards rushing, and that, of course, was in Washington in Week 16, which is another game that is full of anomalies, right? The turnovers, the points given up, all that stuff. Now, it's the same record when he has 117 or more yards of total offense. So not just running, but just as an overall weapon. Now, Barkley is one of 4 running backs this season to rush for over 100 yards against the Washington Commanders. And as much as we hear about how bad this Washington Commanders run defense is, you would think that there'd be more than 4 backs, more than 5 games out of 17 that this team has actually given up 100 yards rushing to. Saquon Barkley has 2 of those games. DeAndre Swift of the Chicago Bears has 1. Derrick Henry of the Baltimore Ravens has 1. And James Conner of the Arizona Cardinals has 1. Now, the Washington Commanders, the key significant stat there is the Washington Commanders are 3-2 in those 5 games. They're 9-3 in all other games. So the win percentage for the Washington Commanders goes up drastically when they're not giving up over 100 yards to a single rusher in a single game. But how much does Saquon Barkley really ride on this thing? Well, the question there is not so much how much can this defense stop Saquon Barkley. It's how much can they stop Saquon Barkley early, combined with how much can the Washington Commanders offense score early. So the Washington Commanders gave up a boatload of yards to Saquon Barkley in the second game between the Washington Commanders and the Philadelphia Eagles. But if you remember, the majority of those yards came in the first half, came really in the first 4 possessions of the game, if I remember correctly. And after that, the Commanders' run defense was able to kind of lock down. Well, that's kind of been the trend for most of the seasons. We see the Washington Commanders' rush defense give up spurts of yards here and there, but for the majority of the game, they actually tend to be fairly solid and fairly effective. Against the Detroit Lions, it was a little bit different. We saw Jahmyr Gibbs get explosive plays really at different points during the game. There wasn't just one run of yards. But that Detroit Lions offense is commonly thought of as a little bit more dynamic, a little bit more more effective in using misdirections. Of course, offensive coordinator Ben Johnson, who, if you haven't heard, is going to be the next head coach of the Chicago Bears, so will no longer be in Detroit, kind of really doing a lot of things to take the discipline away from a defense, as Joe Witt Jr. was talking about. Kellen Moore's offense in Philadelphia is a little bit more straightforward, not as much misdirection, not as much sleight of hand. So I think that's one reason that the Washington Commanders defense has been able to kind of lock down a little bit more in times against a guy like Saquon Barkley. So while Saquon Barkley certainly is going to have an impact on this game, I don't want to downplay his contributions. I think it's more so about what the Washington Commanders offense is doing while Saquon Barkley, or during those moments when Saquon Barkley is doing well. Because you go back to that first loss, Saquon Barkley is ripping off big touchdown runs, and unfortunately the Commanders offense is not able to answer, and that eventually puts too much pressure on the team. They end up losing that game. In this first game, Barkley did most of his damage early. The Washington Commanders offense was able to do enough that when it came down to crunch time, they didn't have to get one-dimensional against the defense. That if you get one-dimensional against them, they're going to come at you very, very difficult, or very, very, very aggressively, I should say, from the front line standpoint. Not necessarily blitz heavy, but they're just going to pin their ears back and pass rush and know how to do that. So those are really the impacts. It's not necessarily Saquon by himself. It's Saquon in relation to what the Commanders offense is doing. If they can continue to start fast in the postseason like they have the first two games, then even if Saquon Barkley eats a little bit to begin this game, it's not going to be too detrimental. It'll be key for the Commanders defense to be able to eventually slow him down, lock him down like they have in the first two games during a stretch, lock him down. The first game, it was early. Second game, it was late. Whenever that time needs to come, they'll have to answer that bell. In other key matchups, Marshawn Lattimore is going to match up against A.J. Brown, Washington's right guard. Whoever that is going to need to help hold off Philadelphia's defensive front. And Quan Martin is going to have his hands full trying to help against Saquon Barkley, but also quarterback Jalen Hurts.